I've been attempting always to make different books. I also, as a poet, I believe in the book as being very important. Not all poets do. My poets are like, no, the poem is what's important, and the book is, you just collect them and throw them together. I kind of like the book. I think that goes back to my early readership as reading books rather than individual poems. So I do have this attraction to these projects that get in my head, and they're kind of history projects usually. So the first one I wrote, though, in which I wasn't speaking in my own voice, was Shannon, about George Shannon going west with Lewis and Clark. And that's one guy's voice, an extended narrative, explaining 16 days in his life where he gets lost from the Lewis and Clark expedition and wanders in Nebraska. And I really enjoyed that project. I was like, wow, this is so interesting, because I'm not me, I'm George Shannon talking. And that experience was very liberating and intriguing. And so even as I finished that book, I said, I want to do this again later. Another kind of history project, tell another story. But this time I want to do it not from one person telling an extended story, but a lot of voices telling a story. And I wonder how that would work. And I had that thought at that moment. Then I wrote a different book first. But I was already thinking, no, I want to do it. And then the story that came to mind, for no particular reason, was the 20th century. Why was it the 20th century? I don't know. I just liked the idea, I guess. It gave me, just as George Shannon, I had a little narrative framework. I knew he got lost in this day and got found this day. So I had a beginning point and end point. Well, the 20th century that begins and it ends. You know when it was. You have these dates, this kind of bookends. And I said, and I can do anything I want in the framework. I can be whoever I want to be, and my original conception was 100 poems, one for each year, and 100 different voices. Fairly rapidly, as I've said about Picasso, I said, no, some voices are going to return. Not because they're more important, but because they they carry the story of the century forward in a certain way. And I didn't have to pick and choose to begin with who was going to be important or who wasn't. I would just write what I wanted to write. So I just started in with that premise, and I said, well, I'll just, start in at a place. I'll start in at the beginning, not because I'm going to write them in order, but because, modernism as a movement and a thought process shaped so much of the culture of the first half of the century, especially that I had to get my mind around it. And so I started with Picasso and Apollinaire. It was also secretly a lot of the, my attraction to certain characters like Picasso or Mao, who come back in the book, is that they both wrote poetry and were poets. Although I don't love their poetry, they had an attraction to poetry. So poetry is kind of buried thread in the book. And I just started in, and Picasso jumped into my head, and I started I said, well, I got to leave the first century, the 20th century. I just got to follow Picasso's life. I had to read all his biographies and stuff. So I'd have, So I just started realizing, and I just started making wall charts, on graph paper of with 100 slots, Like, what do I have? I got 1901, 1904, 1917, 1972. What about here? And and I'd already, then I off of Picasso, I went to Matisse and wrote. There's a number of Matisse poems in the book. So there were certain themes, but then I'd say, well, what am I going to do about World War II and World War I? I mean, how am I going to address them? The book's doesn't have any obligation to do any particular thing, but certain things seem necessary. So I'd be kind of thinking, I wonder what I'll do about that. How will I address that? And I just started filling in this 100-page graph with people, and I knew right away, I want to write about Orson Welles, say, characters I've really always been interested in. And some were easy, and some were hard. People that I really wanted to write about, I could never get a handle on their voice, and they never evolved. And in some cases, I'd already written about stuff a lot. Like, for instance, I think Bob Hope would have been an interesting character for that book. But having already written a 96-page poem about Bob Hope, I couldn't justify writing any more about him. So in some sense, the book is slightly shaped by what I've already written about extensively, and I didn't want to include that. So it just evolved, And over time, I just said, and because I am where I am in my career, I've written many books. I said, this book can take as long as it wants. I don't care how long it takes to write this book. And it took about 10 years. I mean, the first poems were published, in literary magazines 10 years ago. Or I think one of them, I didn't even realize how long it had been. I think the very first poems, some of the Matisse poems, were published in the Yale Review in 2005. And the book came out in 2016. So all this time I was accruing new stuff. Then I would, switch off of it, and because again, I wrote another whole book in the interval, come back to it, pick it up again, reinvest myself in a certain time frame. I said, okay, now I'm going to, forget Picasso. Now let me go to, Einstein or science or philosophy. See what I can get out of that. What am I going to write about here? And it just filled in. And then, eventually eventually I had a wall chart where there was only then it was 50-50, and then I had a wall chart where there was 26 poems yet to be written, and then I had a wall chart where there's 13 poems yet to be written. Then I had 6 or 8 annoying years. I still didn't have a poem for. I'm like, what am I going to do for this year, And you'd think of something, or you wouldn't, or then you could reshuffle the pieces sometimes. So what if I put this poem here, and then I could write a new one about this? And so it was an incredibly enjoyable long-term, project, because each poem itself you could fixate on, and then the longer sense of decades and the century you could fixate on and kind of play with and really detail and plan around. So, it was actually sad to finish that book, because I felt that it had to get done. I'm like, I got to get this book finished. At a certain point, when you're right at the end, now you got to finish it and get it off. But it was sad not to, have this. I had an incredible sense of purpose for the last 4 years. Just going upstairs every day to my office, and I knew right where I had to pick up. Okay, I got to pick it up right here and see what I can get out of this, and get those last poems written, or get this reorganized, get this revised. And you send it off, and you have a kind of you always have a kind of little postpartum sadness when you send a book off. Well, darn, there goes that one, because then you got to start in with the blank page, again. Now where do I go? Luckily I have always got new ideas, but it was sad to finish that one. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed doing the research. Just going on and, going buying used copies of biographies and history books and art books, and just paging through them and letting your mind go and say, that's interesting. I could write a poem about this right over here, and then seeing if it worked.